The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883, and by Wednesday afternoon, Thomas Sullivan was already saddling his horse with the grim determination of a man who had no desire to do what he had been hired to do. He had read the telegram 3 times, partly because the sender, one Margaret Grayson of Boston, Massachusetts, had a way of writing that made even a simple request sound like a legal summons, and partly because Thomas wanted to be absolutely certain he understood the nature of what he was being asked. The words had not changed with each reading, no matter how much he might have wished otherwise. He was to ride out to the New Mexico territory, locate a woman named Margaret Grayson, inform her that her father had passed away, and left the Grayson estate to her provided she returned east to claim it within 60 days, and then escort her safely back to Boston. He would be paid $200 upon her delivery, with $50 in advance already tucked into the envelope that had accompanied the telegram. $250. It was more money than Thomas had seen in one place since he had sold his family's land in Virginia 8 years ago, and it was considerably more than a man who hired himself out as a trail guide, an occasional scout in the territory of New Mexico, could reasonably expect to earn in 3 months. He could not afford to say no. He knew it, and whoever had sent that telegram had clearly counted on exactly that. Thomas was 31 years old. He was tall and lean in the way that men who spent most of their lives on horseback tended to be, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar when it grew too long, and eyes the particular shade of gray-green that made people who met him for the first time unsure whether he was about to laugh or about to do something considerably less pleasant. He had a reputation in the territory as a man who was reliable and fair, who kept his word when he gave it and did not give it carelessly, and who had an uncanny ability to navigate both the physical terrain of the Southwest and the considerably more treacherous terrain of human conflict. He had been hired to escort parties of settlers through Apache territory. He had been hired to find missing cattle and, on 2 separate occasions, missing people. He had once tracked a man for 40 miles through a canyon system in order to deliver a letter that turned out to be a simple notice about a boundary dispute. He had done all of these things without complaint and without much in the way of drama, because drama, in Thomas Sullivan's experience, was what happened when a man started believing his own stories. But he had never been hired specifically to collect a woman and bring her somewhere she did not want to go. He knew she did not want to go because the telegram had said so, buried in the formal language like a rock hidden under shallow water. Miss Grayson has been resident in the New Mexico territory for approximately 2 years and has proven resistant to all previous attempts at communication regarding her return. The previous man we sent was unable to locate her. It is believed she is in the vicinity of a town called Calla Creek, though she may have moved on. We require a man who knows the territory, resistant to all previous attempts at communication, unable to locate her. Thomas finished saddling his horse, a bay gelding named Calhoun, who had carried him through worse circumstances than this, and seemed to have developed a philosophical acceptance of whatever trouble his rider chose to ride toward, and swung up into the saddle. He had supplies for 10 days. Calla Creek was 4 days' ride southwest, through country that was dry and beautiful and entirely indifferent to the urgency of Margaret Grayson's estate matters. He pointed Calhoun's nose toward the horizon and let the horse set the pace. The territory opened up around him as it always did. In that particular way, the Southwest had of making a man feel simultaneously very small and very alive. The sky was the kind of deep, clear blue that people back east painted in watercolors and always got slightly wrong, and the land below it was red and ochre and pale gold, broken by the dark green of scrub and the occasional silver thread of a dry creek bed. Hawks turned slow circles on the thermals overhead. The air smelled of sage and hot dust and something that was almost sweet, almost clean, almost like the idea of beginning. Thomas did not think much about Margaret Grayson during the first day of riding. He thought instead about the route, about the condition of the springs he would need to stop at, about whether the recent Apache raids he had heard about were still active enough to affect his path through the canyon country. He thought about what $250 could buy a man who had not quite decided where he was going to settle down, and was beginning to suspect that the indecision itself might be a kind of answer. By the second day, though, he found himself thinking about her. Not romantically. He was not a man given to romantic speculation about women he had never met, particularly not women he had been hired to transport against their apparent wishes. But practically, who was she? What had brought her out here 2 years ago? A woman from a Boston family with an estate and a father who sent telegrams with legal consequences attached. What was it about this territory, about this life, that had made her decide she preferred it to everything the East could offer? He had met plenty of people who had come west seeking something. Land, freedom, a fresh start after some failure or grief, or simply the suffocating weight of expectation. He had met men who had reinvented themselves so completely out here that the people who had known them before would have walked past them on the street without recognition. He had even met a few women who had done the same, women who had come out as settlers or teachers, or, in some cases, simply on their own recognizance, and who had planted themselves in the red soil of the territory and grown into something the East had never had the right conditions to produce. He was curious about Margaret Grayson. He acknowledged it to himself as Calhoun picked his way through the canyon country on the second afternoon, the walls rising orange and gold on either side, the shadows deep and cool. He was curious, and that was not nothing, because Thomas Sullivan did not often find himself curious about things he had not yet seen. He reached Calla Creek on the fourth day, in the late afternoon when the light was going gold and horizontal, and turning even the modest cluster of buildings that constituted the town into something that looked more significant than it probably was. Calla Creek was not large. It had a main street of perhaps 10 buildings, including a dry goods store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a rooming house, and a small building that had been set up as both a schoolhouse and a church, depending on the day of the week. There was a mill on the creek at the edge of town, and beyond that, scattered at intervals of half a mile or more, were the homesteads of the families who had settled the surrounding land in the past several years. Thomas rode Calhoun to the livery first, because a man who did not take care of his horse in this country was a man who would not be going anywhere, and then he walked to the saloon to find someone who could tell him where Margaret Grayson was. The saloon's interior was dim and smelled of sawdust and whiskey, and the particular kind of human endurance that accumulates in places where people come to be off their feet for a while. There were 6 or 7 men at the bar and at the 2 tables, and a woman behind the bar who was perhaps 50, with gray hair and the kind of steady, assessing gaze that a person develops from years of reading rooms quickly. Thomas ordered a whiskey and asked his question. The woman behind the bar, she introduced herself as Clara Weiss, and she said it in a way that suggested she had sized him up in the first 3 seconds and reached a provisional verdict, studied him for a moment before answering. "What do you want with Margaret?" she said. Not suspiciously, exactly. More like a person who has decided to gather information before sharing any. "I've been sent by her family in Boston," Thomas said. He saw no particular reason to be anything other than direct. "Her father has passed away. There's an estate matter that requires her to return east." Clara Weiss was quiet for a moment. Several of the men at the tables had gone still in the way that people in small towns go still when a stranger says something that concerns someone they know. "And if she doesn't want to go," Clara said. "That's between her and me and whatever she decides," Thomas said. "I'm not in the business of forcing anybody anywhere. I was hired to find her and inform her of the situation and offer to escort her if she chooses to go." Clara looked at him for another moment, and then she nodded slightly as if something had been confirmed. "Margaret's got a homestead about 2 miles east of town," Clara said. "She'll be home this time of day, Follow the creek road and look for the blue shutters. She painted them herself. First summer she was here." Thomas thanked her, finished his whiskey, and went to retrieve Calhoun from the livery. The road along the creek was beautiful in the way that the territory was always beautiful at this hour. The light thick and amber, and the cottonwoods along the water throwing long shadows across the road. Thomas rode slowly, in no particular hurry now that he was close, aware that the next few minutes were going to require a certain amount of care and tact. He saw the house when the road curved slightly to the south. It was a small adobe structure, solid and well kept, with blue shutters that were, in fact, extraordinarily blue, not the faded, washed-out blue of something painted a long time ago and left to the mercy of sun and wind, but a vivid, deliberate blue that seemed to insist on its own presence against the warm earth tones around it. There was a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, carefully tended, and a small pen beside a modest barn where two goats watched Thomas's approach with the serene lack of concern that goats seem to bring to most situations. And there was a woman in the garden. She was kneeling in the soil between rows of what looked like bean plants, and she was working with the focused efficiency of someone who knows exactly what she is doing and why. She was wearing a simple dress in a faded blue-gray color, with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, and her dark hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat that was somewhat less than pristine. She did not look up when he rode into the yard, though Thomas suspected she had heard him coming. "Margaret Grayson," he said. She looked up then. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark eyes that were very direct and a face that was tanned from sun and wind in a way that would have scandalized the social circles of Boston. There was a smear of dirt on her left cheek, and her hands were dark with soil, and she looked at him with the expression of a woman who has learned to assess a stranger quickly and does not feel particularly threatened by the result. "Yes," she said. She did not stand up. "My name is Thomas Sullivan. I've come from Boston from a man named Elliot Grayson." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite grief, not quite fear, something more complicated than either. "My father," she said. "Your father has passed away," Thomas said. He said it plainly, because in his experience plain was usually kinder than gentle when it came to news like this. "I'm sorry for your loss." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She set down the small trowel she had been holding and looked at the dirt on her hands as if seeing them from a distance. "When?" she said. "3 weeks ago. The telegram took some time to reach me, and I've been writing 4 days." He paused. "He left the estate to you, on the condition that you return to Boston within 60 days of his passing to claim it. I was hired to find you and offer to escort you back." She looked up at him again. The complexity in her expression had resolved into something simpler and in some ways harder. "By Elliot," she said. "Yes. Elliot is my father's brother," she said. "He has been trying to get me back to Boston since the month after I arrived here." "He mentioned you had been resistant to previous communications," Thomas said, keeping his voice neutral. A very faint smile crossed her face. "That is one way to describe it." She stood up then, brushing the soil from her hands and her knees, and looked at him with the kind of frankness that people develop when they have spent time in a place that doesn't much care for pretense. "Did he tell you why I left?" "No." "Did you ask?" "I didn't think it was my business," Thomas said. "I was hired to find you and inform you of your legal situation and offer my services as an escort if you chose to make the journey. What I know about your reasons for being here is only what you tell me." She studied him with those direct dark eyes for another moment, and then she made a small sound that might have been a dry laugh or might have been something else entirely. "Well, Mr. Sullivan," she said, "you had better come inside. This conversation is going to take some time." The inside of the house was spare but not stark. There was a quality to it that Thomas recognized immediately, not poverty, but intention. Everything in the room had been chosen and arranged by someone who had thought about what they actually needed and found a kind of satisfaction in that clarity. The furniture was simple, the kind of pieces made by local craftsmen rather than shipped from a catalog. The shelves held more books than he might have expected, and jars of preserved goods, and a small collection of what looked like rock specimens arranged with the deliberateness of things that meant something to the person who had collected them. Margaret put a kettle on the stove and gestured toward the table. "Sit down," she said, and it was not quite an invitation and not quite a command, more like a statement of the obvious next step. Thomas sat. He set his hat on the table beside him and folded his hands and waited. She moved around the small kitchen with the ease of someone thoroughly at home in the space, and he watched her without making it obvious that he was watching, because he was trying to understand who she was and why she had built this particular life here and what it was going to take to have an honest conversation about her future. "My father was a difficult man," Margaret said, her back to him as she set out 2 cups. "Brilliant, in his way. He had a great deal of money and considerable influence in certain circles, and he genuinely believed, not out of cruelty, I think, but out of a kind of structural certainty, that he knew what was best for the people around him." "That's a quality that tends to create problems," Thomas said. "It tends to create daughters who leave for New Mexico," she said. She turned and set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table. "I had been engaged to a man named Frederick Aldrich, who was my father's choice and a perfectly adequate human being by most Boston measurements. I was 24 years old, and I looked at the life in front of me, the house in Beacon Hill, the social calendar, the careful management of Frederick Aldrich's perfectly adequate opinions about everything, and I found that I could not breathe. So you left." "So I left," she said simply. "I had read about the homestead laws. The Desert Land Act. I knew women could file claims. I had a little money of my own, not much, but enough to get here and buy supplies for a first season. I came to Calla Creek because someone on the train had mentioned it as a place where people were still arriving, still building things. And I filed my claim and I built this house, not alone. The people here helped, and I have been here for 2 years and 9 months, and I have grown more in those 2 years than in the previous 24 combined." Thomas was quiet for a moment, listening to the weight of what she had said beneath the words themselves. "The estate," he said. "Does it matter to you?" She wrapped her hands around her cup. "My father and I did not part well. He told me I was throwing my life away. He stopped writing after the first year." She paused. "I continued to write to him. He did not respond, but I continued." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, and he meant it not as a formality but as a genuine response to the particular sorrow in her voice, the sorrow of someone who had loved a difficult person and lost them before the difficulty was resolved. "The estate," she said again, as if tasting the word. "It is considerable. The house, investments, property. Elliot wants it, of course. He has always wanted it. That is why the condition is 60 days. He believes I will not come, and that when I do not come it defaults to him." "Does it?" Thomas said. "I am not entirely sure," she said. "I have not seen the will. I only have what you have told me." She looked at him steadily. "What exactly do you know about the terms?" "Only what I was told in the telegram," Thomas said honestly. "That the estate is left to you conditional on your return within 60 days. I don't know the legal specifics." "I was hired as a guide and escort, not as an attorney." She nodded slowly. "How many days do I have left?" she said. Thomas did it in his head quickly. "Approximately 52, if Elliot's count is accurate." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the cup between her hands. "May I ask you something, Mr. Sullivan?" she said. "You can ask. Do you believe I should go back?" It was a direct question and it deserved a direct answer, but Thomas took a moment to think about it rather than simply responding with whatever was expedient. "I don't think that's for me to say," he said finally. "Whether the estate matters to you, whether the money matters, whether there's anything in Boston worth claiming, those are decisions that belong to you. My job is to make sure you have the information and, if you choose to go, to get you there safely." She looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "But you have an opinion," she said. "I have observations," he said, "which is different. Tell me one." He considered. "You painted your shutters blue," he said. She blinked. "Yes." That's not something a person does when they're not sure they're staying, he said. You built something here, something real. The question of whether to leave it isn't simple, and I would be doing you a disservice if I pretended it was. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, a small, quiet shift, like a door opening an inch. Stay for dinner, she said. It is too late to ride back to town, and the question of what I am going to do is not one I can answer tonight. I need to think. I appreciate that, Thomas said. She cooked, and he helped where she directed him to, and they talked during the cooking and through the meal, not about the estate or the journey, but about other things. She asked him about the territory, about the places he had been, and he told her about the canyon country and the high desert and the particular quality of winter mornings at altitude. She told him about the first season on the homestead, the things she had gotten wrong and the things she had gotten right, the neighbors who had helped her, and what she had learned about livestock and soil and water in 2.5 years of deliberate attention. She was, Thomas discovered, interesting to talk to in the specific way that people who are genuinely engaged with their own lives are interesting to talk to. She asked questions that showed she had been listening, and she offered observations that were sharp without being unkind, and she laughed sometimes at her own mistakes in a way that was entirely without self-pity. He found himself not wanting the conversation to end. He slept that night in the barn, which she offered without apology as the only practical option, and which he accepted without any particular complaint, because he had slept in considerably worse conditions than a clean barn with fresh straw. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to Calhoun's steady breathing nearby and thought about Margaret Grayson. In the morning, she was up before him. He found her at the stove when he came in from the barn, making coffee with the focused morning energy of someone who prefers action to reflection in the early hours. She had a practical, organized quality in the mornings that he appreciated, not hurried, but purposeful, moving through the space with the confidence of someone who has thought through what the day requires. She poured him coffee without asking whether he wanted it, which he found faintly amusing, and then she sat down across from him and said, without preamble, "I have been thinking." "About the estate," he said. "About everything," she said. "About my father and what it means that he left it to me. About Elliot and why he would hire someone like you rather than a lawyer." "Why do you think he hired someone like me?" Thomas said, genuinely curious about her theory. "Because a lawyer would have to be honest about the legal situation," she said. "You were hired to persuade me to come by whatever means necessary. Not legally, I do not think you are that kind of man, but by making the journey seem possible, by being someone I might trust." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair assessment of what I was hired for," he said. "But I'll be honest with you, I would not have taken a job that required me to mislead you about anything material. If you ask me a question, I will tell you what I know." "Then here is my question," she said. "If I go to Boston and claim the estate and discover that the conditions were different from what Elliot represented, and the estate does not actually default to him if I don't return, am I going to feel foolish for having made this journey?" "Possibly," Thomas said. "But not for the reason you're thinking. You'd feel foolish for having let Elliot's maneuvering determine your choice rather than your own assessment of what you want. The real question is whether you have any desire to go back for your father, for the estate, for any reason that belongs to you rather than to Elliot's agenda." She was quiet for a moment, her hands around the coffee cup. "My father died alone," she said softly. "Or perhaps not alone, but without me. And the last thing I wrote him that he read, or that I imagine he read, because he never responded, was a letter telling him that I was not coming back, that I had found my life here and I did not intend to give it up. And now you're wondering if you should have said it differently. I am wondering if I should have found a way to say both things at once," she said. "That I love him and I forgive him and I am still not coming home." Thomas was silent for a moment. "You can still say it," he said. "Going back to settle his estate doesn't mean agreeing with his choices. It might just mean closing something that was left open." She looked at him with a kind of startled consideration, as if she had not expected that particular angle. "You are more thoughtful than the job description suggests," she said. "I'm reliably surprising," Thomas said, and she laughed, a genuine laugh, quick and warm and entirely without performance. That laugh did something to him that he was not quite prepared for. She told him she needed a few days to put her affairs in order before any journey could be considered. She had neighbors who would need to look after the goats and the garden. There were things she needed to settle with the claim office in the county seat to ensure that her homestead rights were properly documented and would not be jeopardized by an extended absence. Thomas said he would wait. He said it without any particular implication, simply as a statement of fact. She looked at him briefly as if checking for hidden meaning in the offer, found none, and nodded. He spent the next 3 days in Calla Creek, sleeping at the saloon that Clara Weiss ran and spending his time learning the town. He was good at that, at becoming part of a place quickly enough that people talked to him naturally, without the reserve that strangers usually encounter. He helped the blacksmith for a few hours one afternoon, because the man was behind on work and Thomas had some skill with iron. He had a long conversation with a farmer named Jacob Hawthorne who had homesteaded here 4 years ago, and who talked about the land with the love of a man who had chosen exactly right. He listened to Clara Weiss talk about the first years of the town, when there had been perhaps a dozen families, and the nearest source of supplies had been 2 days' ride in any direction. He went back to Margaret's homestead in the evenings. He told himself this was practical, that it was easier to discuss arrangements when they were face to face, and there was truth in that, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he had begun to look forward to the moment when she would appear at the door of the house with the blue shutters and the expression that started at cautious and moved toward something warmer as the evening progressed, and that he was increasingly aware of the quality of attention she gave him when they talked, the way she listened with her whole self rather than just waiting for her turn to speak. On the second evening, she showed him the rocks, the collection on the shelf that he had noticed on the first day. She picked them up one by one and told him where each one had come from, this one from the mesa to the north, on a day in her first summer when she had ridden out by herself just to see what was up there. This one from the canyon country, the deep red sandstone that seemed to hold the color of sunset even in the shade. This one from the creek bed, smooth and gray and ordinary until you looked at it in the light and saw the faint shimmer of minerals running through it. He held each one as she offered it, feeling the weight of them and the different textures, and listened to the small stories attached to each, and understood that what she was actually showing him was her map of this place, the territory as she had come to know it, marked not on paper but in the physical weight of stone. "You love it here," he said. It was not quite a question. "I have never loved anything as consistently," she said. "Even on the bad days, and there are bad days, Mr. Sullivan. Do not let anyone tell you the frontier life is romantic. There are days when the well runs low, and the goat is sick, and the wind comes up, and you eat beans again for the 4th night running." She paused. "Even on those days I go to sleep in my own house that I built with my own hands, and I wake up in the morning and the sky is that color and I think, yes, this is right." Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching her face as she said it. "What is it like on the good days?" he said, and the expression that came across her face then was something he thought about for a very long time afterward. It was not dramatic, not ecstatic. It was quiet and full and entirely unguarded, the expression of a person describing something they have come to trust completely. "On the good days," she said, "it is like being exactly the right size for your own life." On the third evening, a situation arose that was less peaceful. Thomas had ridden out to the homestead in the late afternoon and found Margaret in an agitated state that she was not quite managing to conceal behind her usual composure. A man was there, a big, florid man named Denton Warfield, who ran a cattle operation south of Calla Creek, and who had apparently been trying to purchase Margaret's land claim for the better part of a year. Thomas assessed the situation in the first few seconds from the porch, the particular quality of the tension between them. The way Margaret was standing with her arms crossed and her chin level. The way Warfield's voice had the tone of a man who is accustomed to people eventually agreeing with him. "I'm just saying," Warfield was saying when Thomas stepped up to the porch, "that a woman alone on a claim this size is not practical, and I am offering a fair price." "The price is not the issue," Margaret said. "I have told you 3 times that the land is not for sale." "Evening," Thomas said pleasantly, and both of them looked at him. Warfield looked Thomas over with the assessing squint of a man trying to determine what he was dealing with, and Thomas looked back with the particular kind of stillness that he had learned conveyed more effectively than any posturing exactly where the line was. "This a friend of yours?" Warfield said to Margaret. "Yes," Margaret said, without hesitation, and Thomas noted the choice of word. "Mr. Sullivan," Thomas said, extending his hand in a way that was friendly and entirely immovable. Warfield shook it, and Thomas noted the deliberate firmness of the grip and matched it without exceeding it, and Warfield seemed to recalibrate slightly. "Miss Grayson has made her position clear," Thomas said mildly, "and you've made yours. Seems like that's a completed conversation." Warfield looked at him for a moment longer, then looked at Margaret, and then he made the kind of decision that men make when they realize that pressing further will cost more than it will gain. He put his hat on and walked to his horse and left without further comment. Margaret let out a long breath when he was gone. "He has been coming around since the spring," she said. "He has some idea that he is going to expand his operation across this whole valley, and the smaller claims are in his way." "Has he been threatening?" Thomas said. "Not directly. He is careful with his words, but the implication is always there that a woman alone cannot manage this properly, that it would be easier if I simply sold and went somewhere else." She paused. "He does not understand that the reason I cannot sell is not stubbornness. It is that this land is what I have made myself into. Selling it would be like selling a piece of my own character." Thomas thought about that for a moment. "I understand that," he said. She looked at him. "Do you?" "I sold my family's land in Virginia after the war," he said. "After my father passed and my brother moved west, it needed to be sold. There was no practical way to keep it. But I have never been entirely easy about it." She was quiet for a moment. "I did not know you were from Virginia," she said. "I'm from a lot of places," he said. "That's what happens when you spend 8 years on horseback." They ate dinner again, and afterward they sat on the porch in the cooling evening air and watched the stars appear, first 1 or 2, and then suddenly all of them at once, the way they always did out here, as if the sky had been waiting for the right moment to commit. Margaret asked him about Virginia, and he told her about it, the particular green of it, the humidity, the way the seasons changed with a kind of drama that was different from the Southwest's drama, but no less real. He told her about his father and the land and what had happened after the war, the way so much of that whole world had been unmade and remade in ways that still felt unresolved. She told him about Boston, not unkindly, because she was not the kind of person who needed to diminish what she had left in order to justify leaving it. She described the particular beauty of the harbor in winter, the way the city smelled of salt and coal smoke, the social world of drawing rooms and calling cards that she had navigated for 24 years with increasing awareness that it was a world designed for someone who was not quite her. "I was not unhappy," she said. "That is what I could never explain to my father. I was not miserable or oppressed or suffering in any dramatic way. I was simply present in the wrong life. Wearing a costume that was almost the right size but not quite, and beginning to understand that eventually the ill fit would become irreversible." "And you could not make the case to him," Thomas said. "He heard what he expected to hear," she said. "He expected me to want what he wanted for me, the good marriage, the social position, the continuation of the life he had built. And because he expected it, he heard it even when I was saying something quite different." Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I'm sorry you lost him before it was resolved," he said. She looked at him sideways, and in the faint light from the open door, he could see something in her expression that was not quite composed in the usual way. "Thank you," she said softly. "That is the thing I keep coming back to. Not whether I was right to leave, I was right, I believe that. But whether there was a way to leave that might have kept the door open. Maybe this is the door," Thomas said. "Going back to close the estate. Not agreeing with him, not undoing what you've built here, just closing the chapter properly." She was quiet for a long time after that. The next morning she told him she had decided to go. She said it over breakfast, in the same direct way she said most things, looking at him across the table with her coffee cup in her hands. "I am going to go to Boston," she said. "Not because Elliot wants me to, and not because I am giving up this claim. I have spoken with Jacob Hawthorne and his wife. They will look after the goats in the garden and keep an eye on the house while I am gone. I have a letter to leave with the claim office protecting my rights during absence." She paused. "I am going because my father is dead, and there are things I need to say, and burying them under a legal transaction seems like a poor way to honor them." Thomas looked at her for a moment. "That's a sound reason," he said. "Also," she said, and there was a slight shift in her expression, something wry and careful, "I am curious about what is actually in that will. Elliot has been trying to bring me back for nearly 3 years. I would like to know why it matters so much to him." "That's also a sound reason," Thomas said, and she smiled briefly. They left Calla Creek 2 days later. The Hawthorns came to see her off, Jacob and his wife Ruth, who was a small, capable woman with warm eyes, and their 3 children who thought Margaret was something close to wonderful and showed it by hanging on her arms until she laughed and made them let go. Clara Weiss came down from the saloon and pressed a package of food into Margaret's hands and told her to come back before winter. With a directness that was the closest thing to affection Clara appeared to express. Margaret said her goodbyes with the composure of a woman who does not like goodbyes and compensates by making them brief. But Thomas noticed the moment when she turned to look back at the house with the blue shutters, and the quality of that look, the ownership in it, the pride, and underneath those things, something that was simply love, and he filed it away carefully. The plan was to ride to the railroad at Las Vegas, New Mexico, and from there take the train east. It was 3 days' ride to Las Vegas on the route Thomas had planned, and from there, depending on the schedule and connections, perhaps 4 or 5 days by train to Boston. On the first day of riding, they were mostly quiet, settling into the rhythm of travel together. Thomas watched the way Margaret handled her horse, a steady roan mare named Pearl, and was satisfied. She was not a flashy rider, but she was a competent one, with the practical awareness of a person who has learned horsemanship as a useful skill rather than a performance. They stopped at noon at a spring in the shade of a red sandstone formation and ate from the food Clara had packed, and as the afternoon began they talked more easily, because distance does something to conversation that sitting still does not. It loosens things, makes space for thoughts that might feel too large in a closed room. She asked him about his work, not just the practical details but what it was like, what he felt, riding through the territory alone, guiding people through country they didn't know. He told her honestly, which meant that he said both the things that were good about it and the things that were less good. The freedom of it, the intimacy with the land. The loneliness of it, which was not always bad but was always present. The way a man in his position existed in a strange kind of suspension between belonging everywhere and owning nowhere. "Does that bother you?" she asked. "It used to," he said. "Lately I've started to wonder whether the suspension is a problem or just a description." "A description of what?" "Of a man who hasn't decided yet," he said. She looked at him sideways from beneath the brim of her hat. "What would make you decide?" "I'm not entirely sure," he said. And then, after a moment, "I used to think it would be land, finding the right piece of land and putting down roots the way my father had. But I've been looking at land for 8 years, and nothing has felt like the right kind of right." "What does the right kind of right feel like?" she said. "I imagine it feels like exactly the right size for your own life," he said. She recognized her own words and was quiet for a moment, and when he glanced at her, he saw the color in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. They made camp that first evening at a place Thomas knew, where the creek widened into a shallow pool surrounded by cottonwoods, and the grass was good and the wood was dry. He set up the camp with efficient practice while she unsaddled the horses, and they worked together naturally, without the need for much direction, the kind of easy collaboration that sometimes takes years to develop and sometimes arrives already present, as if it had simply been waiting. After dinner, with the fire burning low and the stars filling the enormous sky, Margaret said, "Tell me something you have never told anyone else." Thomas considered this seriously because he was a man who took questions seriously. "There is a mesa," he said finally, "about 40 miles northeast of Calla Creek in the canyon country. I found it about 4 years ago, riding alone. You can only get to the top by a particular route that is not obvious. There is a shelf of rock that looks solid from below but is actually passable if you go along it to the east and climb the break. And at the top there is a flat expanse about 3 acres wide, with grass and a natural catchment that holds water, and from the edge you can see for perhaps 60 miles in every direction." He paused. "I have been back 3 times. I have never taken anyone there, and I have never described it to anyone." She was watching him with complete attention. "Why?" she said. "I don't entirely know," he said. "I think partly because some things belong to themselves and sharing them changes them." But partly he stopped. "Partly," she said softly, "partly because I have been waiting without quite knowing it for someone who would understand what it was for," he said. The fire made small sounds in the silence. Above them, the Milky Way was a river of light from horizon to horizon, and the cottonwoods made a soft sound in the slight wind, and neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched and deepened and became something else, something that was no longer comfortable silence but charged silence, the kind that accumulates between 2 people who are becoming aware of something that has been growing in the space between them. Margaret looked at the fire. "Thomas," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. They both noticed it. "Yes," he said. "I am going to Boston because it is the right thing to do," she said. "But I want you to understand that I am also coming back." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I want to make sure you know," she said. "Because I find that the question of whether you will still be in the territory when I return has become more significant to me than it should be, given that I have known you for less than a week." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. An owl called somewhere in the cottonwoods. "How long do you need to be in Boston?" he said. 2 weeks, I think. Perhaps 3, depending on the legal matters." "I'll be in the territory," he said. "I'll be in Calla Creek when you come back." She looked at him, and the expression on her face in the firelight was something he thought he might carry with him for the rest of his life regardless of what happened next. "All right," she said softly. They reached Las Vegas on the evening of the 3rd day, and Thomas arranged her passage on the eastbound train that departed the following morning. He had said, in Calla Creek, that his job was to escort her to Boston, and Margaret had told him that if he spent his own money on a train ticket to Boston and back simply to fulfill the technical terms of Margaret Grayson's contract, she would be very annoyed with him. He had agreed that he would see her onto the train and then wait. The morning of her departure, they stood on the platform in the early light with the engine making its vast, impatient sounds, and the smell of coal smoke and oil in the air, and the peculiar compressed feeling of a moment that is about to change into the next thing. Margaret had her trunk with her and her travel bag and the practical traveling dress she had changed into in the hotel, and she looked every inch the Boston woman she had been raised to be, except for the tan on her face and the quality of composure in her eyes that had not come from Beacon Hill, but from 2.5 years of red soil and blue shutters and the reliable revelation of the southwest sky. 3 weeks at most, she said. "I'll be there," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those direct dark eyes, and then she did something that he had not expected. She reached out and put her hand briefly against his jaw, Just a touch, just a moment, and then she picked up her bag and walked toward the train. He stood on the platform and watched until the train was out of sight, and then he stood there a little longer, his hand at his side, aware of the particular quality of air that seems to fill a space where someone was just standing. He was there for 3 weeks and 2 days, doing the work that accumulated while he waited, a job guiding a surveying party through the canyon country north of Las Vegas, which gave him 4 days in the field and 6 more settling accounts and resupplying. He spent the evenings writing in the small notebook he carried, which he had never shown to anyone, and the nights lying in his bedroll listening to the enormous quiet of the territory and thinking about the conversation by the firelight and the touch of her hand against his face. He rode back to Calla Creek a week before her expected return and found that she had already sent a letter ahead, which Clara Weiss presented to him with an expression of knowing amusement that he chose not to acknowledge. The letter was dated from Boston 5 days prior. It was 4 pages long, and it was the most direct, honest, and occasionally devastating piece of writing he had read in years. She wrote about arriving in Boston and finding it simultaneously familiar and foreign, like visiting a room from your childhood, and discovering that the furniture is not as large as you remembered. She wrote about Elliot, who was exactly as she had expected, all polished manners and calculated condescension, who had presented her with the will and the estate inventory with the air of a man who expected her to be overwhelmed and grateful. She had not been overwhelmed. She had read the will carefully and then asked the family's lawyer, a Mr. Horace Plimpton, whose allegiance was clearly to the estate rather than to Elliot's agenda, a series of questions that Elliot had apparently not expected her to think to ask. The 60-day condition was real. The estate was real and substantial. But there was also, buried in a codicil that Elliot had not mentioned, a provision that allowed her to transfer management of the Boston properties to a trustee while retaining ownership and drawing income, which would have allowed her to stay in New Mexico indefinitely while still claiming the inheritance. Elliot had known about this provision. He had simply not mentioned it, counting on her ignorance of estate law and her presumed unwillingness to make the journey. She had been, she wrote, both furious and strangely satisfied. She wrote about sitting in her father's study the first evening after Elliot had gone, alone with the room that had always seemed to represent everything she was and was not in relation to her father. She had found on the desk the letters she had sent him during the years he had not responded. He had kept them all. Every one. They were in a stack in the second drawer, tied with a piece of ribbon. Thomas stopped reading for a moment when he reached that part. She wrote, "I cannot tell you what it meant to find them there, Thomas. It meant that he had read them. It meant that he knew exactly what my life here had become, that I had told him about Pearl and the goats and the bean garden and the blue shutters and the way the sky looks in October, and he had kept all of it in his drawer. I think he was too proud to respond and too sad not to keep it. I think he understood at the end more than he ever said, and I think I will carry that grief and that comfort together for the rest of my life. I am coming home. I mean Calla Creek. I am coming home in 6 days' time if the train schedule holds, and Mr. Plimpton has everything in hand, and Elliot is furious in the particularly impotent way of a man who has overplayed his hand and knows it. I have signed the trustee arrangement, and I have the income from the estate, and I have already written to Jacob Hawthorne to check on Pearl." There was one more line after that, and Thomas read it twice. "I have been thinking about a mesa 40 miles northeast, with a shelf of rock and a view for 60 miles in every direction, and whether the offer is still open. If it is, I think I would very much like to see it. If you know of anyone who might be willing to show it to me, please ask him to be in Calla Creek when the Thursday train arrives in Las Vegas." He was in Calla Creek on Thursday. He had, in fact, been in Calla Creek since Sunday, which was not something he was going to admit to, except that Clara Weiss raised an eyebrow at him when he came in for dinner on Sunday night, and he said, "Not a word," and she said, "I haven't said anything. with the satisfied expression of someone who has all the information they need. He rode to Las Vegas on Wednesday afternoon and checked into the hotel, and spent Wednesday evening in a state of anticipation that he found faintly ridiculous and entirely beyond his control. He was 31 years old, and he had been in situations that required genuine physical courage without feeling the kind of unsteadiness he felt now, sitting in a hotel dining room pushing food around a plate, thinking about a woman on a train coming through Kansas. The train arrived at noon on Thursday, 20 minutes late. He was on the platform. She came down the steps with her trunk being carried by a porter and her travel bag in her own hand. And she looked exactly herself, that particular combination of East and West that was entirely her own, the Boston dress and the Southwest composure, and the direct dark eyes scanning the platform and finding him. She stopped walking when she saw him. He walked toward her and she met him halfway. They stood for a moment looking at each other on the platform with the noise and steam of the train around them, and neither of them said anything immediately, because it seemed that what needed to be said was not quite verbal yet, and attempting to put it into words prematurely would be a waste. Then Margaret said, "You came." "I said I would," he said. "You did," she said. And she smiled, not the quick, wry smile he had seen most often, but something fuller and quieter that he thought was probably the smile that appeared when she was not managing her expression at all. He took the travel bag from her hand without asking. She let him. They rode back to Calla Creek the next day, starting in the early morning when the desert was still cool and the light was horizontal and copper, and the conversation that had been building for 3 weeks of separation found its way out over the miles with the ease of things that have been composting quietly in the dark and are now ready. She told him about the letters in the drawer. She told him more than she had written, the feeling of sitting in that room with those letters, reading her own words back through her father's silent keeping of them, understanding something about love and obstinacy and the terrible waste of time that pride creates. She cried a little, telling it, without apparent embarrassment, and he listened without attempting to fix what did not need fixing. He told her things he had not told her before. About Virginia, about the years after the war, about the long process of becoming someone who belonged to movement rather than to place, and the slow understanding that this was not entirely a loss. About the people he had met in the territory and what they had taught him about the many different forms a life could take, and how this had eventually become not a restlessness but an education. She listened the way she always did, entirely, attentively, with the quality of someone who is actually taking in what they hear rather than simply waiting for silence. "Thomas," she said, somewhere in the middle of the second day, when they were riding through a stretch of country where the afternoon light was doing something particularly magnificent to the landscape, turning the red rock faces into something that glowed from within, catching the silver undersides of the sage leaves and turning the distant mountains purple. "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking about what you said," she said. "About a man who hasn't decided yet, about what would make him decide." He looked at her. She was looking ahead, at the country in front of them, and her voice was careful in the way that people are careful when they are about to say something that matters. "I'm thinking about it too," he said. She turned to look at him. "Are you?" "I have been thinking about almost nothing else for 3 weeks," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said with the directness that was entirely her own, "I want to be very clear about something so that we are not conducting this conversation at cross purposes." "Please," he said. "I am not going back to Boston," she said. "I am staying in Calla Creek. The homestead is mine, and I intend to build it into something significant over the next several years. I have the estate income now, which means I can do things I could not do on the homestead budget alone, and I have plans for it, a proper orchard, and I have been thinking about horses, real breeding stock, because this territory needs it." She paused. "I am telling you this not as a warning but as a context." "I understand," he said. "The context is," she continued, "that I am building a life in Calla Creek. I am not interested in building it alone, but I am prepared to do so if that is what is required, because I know myself well enough to know that the wrong company would be worse than no company." She paused again, and her voice was entirely steady, but her hands were not. Quite, he could see the slight tension in them on Pearl's reins. "And you are clearly not the wrong company. So the question I am constructing in my rather extended and architecturally ambitious way is, Margaret," he said. "Yes. I know what the question is," he said. "And the answer is yes." She looked at him with wide eyes. "You don't know precisely what I was going to ask." "You were going to ask whether I had any interest in staying," he said, "in Calla Creek, in the context you described." A pause. "More or less," she admitted. "The answer is yes," he said again. "More than yes. I have been sitting with the question of what comes next for 8 years, and I am reasonably certain that what comes next is this conversation and whatever follows it." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked forward again at the road, and when she spoke again her voice was quieter. "I do not want to be hasty," she said. "We have known each other for less than a month. Less than a month of knowing and years of whatever you want to call the thing before you meet the person," he said. "I'm not proposing a decision tomorrow. I'm proposing that we stop pretending this is a professional arrangement and start treating it as what it actually is." "And what is that?" she said, and now there was something in her voice that was entirely undefended. "Something that is going to be very important," he said, "to both of us, if we let it." The last miles into Calla Creek were ridden mostly in a comfortable quiet that was no longer the silence of two people being careful, but the silence of two people who have said the important things and are now simply together in it. Clara Weiss was at the door of the saloon when they rode in, and her expression said everything about what she had already concluded. The blue shutters were exactly as Margaret had left them. The goats were fine. Pearl went into the barn with an air of profound satisfaction at returning to her own stall. The bean garden had been tended by Ruth Hawthorne, and was, if anything, better maintained than when Margaret had left. The house smelled of dust and sunlight in closed rooms, and Margaret opened the windows one by one and let the September air in. Thomas stayed, as he had the first time, in the barn. In the morning she made coffee, and they sat at the table as they had done before, except that everything was different now. Not the table and not the coffee and not the quality of the morning light through the open door, but the space between them which had acquired a new kind of charge, something warm and present and growing. He stayed in Calla Creek. Not in the barn. After a few days, Clara Weiss gave him a room at the saloon at a rate that was clearly below market value, and with the air of someone doing community service. But present, in the way that mattered, which was that he was there when Margaret needed another set of hands for the work, and there in the evenings when the work was done. And the conversations that they had were no longer the conversations of strangers exploring each other's histories, but the conversations of two people building a shared understanding of the present and the future. He went with her to look at the property for the orchard she had planned, and they walked the land together on a clear October morning, and she described what she saw in the space: the rows of apple and pear trees, the way the water from the creek could be directed with a small system of channels, the long view from the northern edge. And he listened and asked questions and offered the kind of practical observations that come from knowing the land and the climate. And when she said, "What do you think?" he said, "I think it's exactly right." And she looked at him with such gratitude and satisfaction that something in his chest performed a complicated action that he had no word for, but which he found he had developed a great fondness for. She asked him, one afternoon in mid-October when they were riding in the canyon country north of town, to show her the mesa. He had been wondering when she would ask again. He had been thinking about it since her letter. They rode northeast for the better part of the morning, and when the canyon walls rose around them, Thomas navigated by memory and something more instinctive than memory. And then he found the shelf of rock and said, "We need to dismount and lead them here." She followed him along the shelf, with the canyon dropping away to their left and the wall rising to the right, and Calhoun and Pearl picked their way carefully, And then there was the break in the rock, and Thomas went up first and turned back to offer her his hand. She took it. They came up onto the top of the mesa, and the view happened all at once, as it always did, the sudden vast expansion of the world. The 60 miles of territory spread out below them in every direction, the canyon country to the south and west, the mountains to the north, the pale glitter of the distant river, the enormous sky that had been high before and was now somehow higher. Margaret stood absolutely still for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Oh." Thomas stood beside her and did not say anything because there was nothing useful to add. After a while she said, "This is the thing, isn't it? This is what you meant." "Yes," he said. "Being exactly the right size for your own life," she said. "Yes," he said again. She turned to look at him, and they were very close in the way that people become close without noticing when they are both looking at the same thing. Her eyes were bright and her cheeks were wind-flushed, and she was looking at him with the expression that he had been collecting, the way she had collected the rocks on her shelf, each one marking a specific place and time and weight. "Thomas," she said. "Margaret," he said. And then she kissed him, or he kissed her, or it was entirely mutual later. Neither of them would be able to say with certainty, which seemed right, seemed like exactly the correct way for it to have happened. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kind of kiss that arrives already knowing what it is, unhurried and certain, with the vast October sky overhead, and the territory spread out in every direction, and two people who had arrived, through quite different routes, at the same conclusion about what mattered. When they separated, he kept his hands at her face for a moment, and she kept her hands at his chest, and they looked at each other with the particular stunned clarity of something confirmed. "I'm still not going back to Boston," she said, and her voice was slightly unsteady in a way it had not been since he had known her. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to." "Good," she said, "because this is my home and I would like it very much if you would consider making it yours as well." He looked at her and at the landscape behind her, and at the quality of the light on everything, and thought about the 8 years of not quite belonging and the feeling of rightness that had been building since the moment he rode into the yard with the blue shutters. "I think," he said slowly, "that this is the right kind of right." Her smile then was the fullest he had ever seen from her, unguarded and complete and entirely, specifically herself. He kissed her again, there on the top of the mesa, with the wind in the grass and the hawks turning their slow circles below them, and the world spread out for 60 miles in every direction. And for the first time in a very long time, Thomas Sullivan was exactly where he intended to be. The following months were the kind that a person does not often get in a life, months of the work being good, and the company being good, and the daily accumulation of small things that add up to something significant. Thomas filed his own homestead claim on the adjacent land to the north of Margaret's property, because the law required a claimant to be on the land, and because it made practical sense for the operation they were beginning to envision together. The land connected at the north fence line, and in practice functioned as one operation. He built himself a house on his claim, though he was rarely in it in the evenings, and this arrangement was noted by everyone in Calla Creek with a collective amusement that was entirely benevolent. He helped her begin the orchard. They planted the first trees in late October, in long rows along the south-facing slope, with the channels for water already in place. It was the kind of work that required faith, planting trees that would not bear fruit for several years, trusting the land and the water and the patience required. Thomas found that he had no difficulty with this. He had spent 8 years in a kind of suspension, not planting anything, and now that the planting had begun, the patience came naturally. Denton Warfield came around once more in November, and this time he addressed himself to Thomas as well as to Margaret. And Thomas explained, very calmly and with a specificity that left no ambiguity, that the land was not for sale and would not become for sale, and that Warfield's interest in the matter should be considered fully concluded. Warfield left. He did not come back. Clara Weiss hosted a dinner at the saloon the week before Christmas, with most of the town in attendance, and she made a toast that included something about the stubbornness of Easterners who came west and the particular stubbornness of men who followed them. And everyone laughed, and Margaret and Thomas looked at each other across the table with expressions that were private and full and entirely obvious. He asked her to marry him on a January morning in 1884, when the land was cold, and the sky was that particular winter blue, and there was ice at the edges of the creek, and everything was very still and very clear. He had not planned an elaborate moment. He had simply found himself sitting across from her at breakfast in the house with the blue shutters, watching her read a letter from Mr. Plimpton in Boston about the estate accounts, and the question had arrived in him with the same certainty as everything else about this, and he had said it. "Margaret, will you marry me?" She had looked up from the letter. "Yes," she said, "immediately, if possible." It was not quite immediately, because these things required arrangements, but it was February, which was close enough. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, who came through Calla Creek every 6 weeks or so, in the small building that served as church and schoolhouse, with most of the town present and Ruth Hawthorne crying quietly and Clara Weiss maintaining her dignity entirely. Margaret wore a dress that was not her wedding dress from Boston. That had been left behind with the rest of a life she had folded up and put away, not in anger but simply in conclusion. The dress she wore was one she had made herself, a deep blue that was not quite the color of the shutters but belonged to the same family, and she wore her hair down, which she did only on specific occasions, and she looked, Thomas thought, watching her walk toward him like exactly herself. Like exactly the right version of herself, in exactly the right place, wearing exactly the right blue. He said his vows with the steadiness of a man who means every word and knows it, and she said hers with that particular quality of attention she brought to everything that mattered. And when it was done, and they were standing face to face with the January light coming through the small windows, and everyone applauding in the way of people genuinely happy about the occasion, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the thing that passed between them was entirely wordless and entirely sufficient. The land around Calla Creek continued to change during the years that followed, as the territory was changing all around them. The coming of more settlers, the railroad pushing further through, the slow and painful process of the land coming under various kinds of legal and political management that did not always serve the people who had lived there longest. Thomas and Margaret both understood, because they had both paid attention, that the prosperity they were building was built on land that had not always been available for the taking, and that the Apache and Navajo and Pueblo peoples whose history was written in the stone and soil of this place had been pushed and restricted in ways that were unjust and ongoing. Thomas had known this for years, had seen it directly in his time guiding parties through the territory, and Margaret had come to understand it through the relationships she had built with the people in and around Calla Creek, including some who carried that history personally. They could not undo what had been done, but they could be honest about it, and they could be the kind of neighbors and citizens who did not pretend that the land had simply been waiting for them. Their first child was born in the autumn of 1884, a boy they named James, after Margaret's father, which she had decided on without ambivalence, and which Thomas had agreed to with the understanding that naming a son after a difficult man was not the same as forgiving the difficulty. It was something more complicated and more generous than forgiveness. James arrived at the homestead on an October morning, delivered by Ruth Hawthorne, who had experience in these matters, with Thomas in the next room in a state of entirely undignified anxiety that Margaret teased him about for years afterward. James was healthy and loud, and had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubbornness, which became apparent earlier than anyone had expected, and which everyone who knew both his parents found entirely appropriate. The orchard produced its first fruit in the spring of 1887. It was not a large harvest. The trees were still young and the yield was modest, but they picked the apples and the pears in the cool morning air with James, now 2.5, underfoot and enthusiastic, and Margaret held up the first apple and looked at it with the expression of someone who has waited 3 years for this exact moment and finds that it is completely worth it. Thomas watched her holding that apple in the light of the September morning. This woman who had come west alone at 24, with a small amount of money, and a determination that had turned out to be equal to everything the territory required of her. And he thought about the telegram that had arrived on a Tuesday in 1883, and the $50 in the envelope and the bay horse, and the 4 days' ride and the blue shutters. He thought about what Margaret Grayson had intended when he sent that telegram. He had intended to use Thomas as a tool to bring Margaret back to a life she had already outgrown, to recover an inheritance he wanted for himself, to undo the things she had built here. He had intended it all to work out to his advantage, which it had not, and Thomas imagined that Elliot had not thought of the matter in some time, because men like Elliot moved on to the next calculation quickly when the previous one failed. What Elliot had actually produced by sending that telegram was this: a morning in September in an orchard in New Mexico territory, with apple trees in rows and a boy running between them and a woman holding a first fruit in the light, and a man standing at the edge of it all thinking that the East had nothing in its drawing rooms and its legal language and its careful calculations of advantage, that came close to this. Margaret looked up and caught him watching her. "Come here," she said. He walked through the rows to her and she put the apple in his hand. "First one," she said. He looked at it, red and imperfect and entirely real. "Worth waiting for," he said. She looked at him with those direct dark eyes, and then she looked at James, who had stopped running long enough to look at both of them with the serene curiosity of a child who has grown up in a place where the world seems to largely make sense. "Yes," she said simply. "Worth every bit of it." That winter, Margaret discovered she was expecting again, and this news was received with the same kind of quiet, complete joy as the orchard's first harvest, something earned and chosen and arriving in its right time. Their second child was a girl, born in July of 1888 on a day when the summer lightning was working its way across the mountains to the north, and the air smelled of rain and electricity. They named her Clara, after the woman behind the bar at the saloon in Calla Creek, who had told a stranger with dark gray-green eyes where to find a woman with blue shutters on a golden afternoon in 1883, and without whom none of the rest of it would have been possible. Clara Weiss, upon learning this, said only that it was about time someone named something after her, and then went into the back room of the saloon for several minutes, from which she returned with red eyes that she attributed to the dust. The homestead by 1889 was something that had grown well past the modest adobe house and the kitchen garden that Margaret had built in her first years alone. Thomas's land and hers had been combined into a formal joint claim with the help of Mr. Plimpton, who had turned out to be a good deal more useful than Elliot had intended when he hired him. There was the orchard now, properly producing, and a horse operation that Thomas had built with real care and knowledge, breeding working stock that was suited to the territory horses that could handle the altitude and the heat and the rough country, horses that were in demand from ranchers and the army both, though Thomas was selective about who he sold to and kept close track of where the animals went. There was also, by then, a small school that Margaret had helped found in Calla Creek, one that operated year-round rather than on the abbreviated schedule of the original building, with a trained teacher who had come out from back east at Margaret's specific recruitment. Margaret had funded the first year's salary herself, from the estate income, and then organized the families of the area to contribute on an ongoing basis. She had done this with the same practical thoroughness with which she had done everything else, and the school was now a fixture of the town, with 23 students at its last count. In the evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed, James a tall 5-year-old with opinions about everything, Clara still an infant but already demonstrating a capacity for focused attention, that reminded everyone of her mother. Thomas and Margaret sat on the porch of the house with the blue shutters and looked at whatever the sky was doing. The sky in New Mexico territory did something different every evening. Sometimes it was all fire in the west, the sun going down in stages of orange and red and deep purple that seemed almost aggressive in their beauty. Sometimes it was subtle, a pale gradient from gold to green to the first blue-black of night, with the first star appearing like a punctuation mark. Sometimes there were clouds that turned into something architectural at sunset, towers and ramparts of copper and rose. Sometimes there was lightning in the mountains, silent and precise at that distance. They had watched this sky for 6 years now. They had watched it together for 5. "Do you think about Boston?" Thomas asked her once, on an evening in the autumn of 1889, when the air was cooling, and James had finally gone to bed after the protracted negotiation that was every evening's bedtime. Margaret considered the question seriously, as she always did. "I think about my father," she said. "Sometimes. I think about the letters in the drawer and whether there was more time I could have taken to understand him before I left. I think about the things I was right about when I left and the things I was not quite right about." She paused. "I do not think about going back." "No, no," she said, with the certainty of someone who has checked the question many times and found the same answer. "This is my life. This is where I live." She looked at him sideways. "Do you think about Virginia?" "Sometimes," he said honestly. "The green of it, the sound of it in summer, my father's hands." "But not going back." "No," he said, "not going back." She reached over and took his hand in both of hers, the way she sometimes did when they were sitting on the porch and the evening was big and quiet around them. "Then we are exactly where we should be," she said. He looked at her and at the porch and at the blue shutters and at the orchard rows visible in the last light and at the mountains going dark against the sky and at James's small hat hanging on the post by the door and at Clara's quilt draped over the porch rail and at all the accumulated evidence of a life chosen carefully and built with real hands. "Yes," he said, "we are." The mesa to the northeast was still there, as mesas tend to be. They had been back twice together, once on the 3rd anniversary of their first visit, and once on a particularly golden morning in October 1887, when they had left James with the Hawthorns and ridden out together at dawn, and climbed the shelf of rock in the early light, and stood at the top with the territory spread out in every direction, and the air still cold and sharp, and everything below them waiting for the sun. Thomas had thought, standing there, that he would bring his children up there someday. James first, when he was old enough to manage the climb, and then Clara. He would show them the shelf of rock and the way you had to go east along it to find the break, and he would bring them up to the top and let the view happen all at once, as it always did, and he would watch their faces at the moment the world opened up. He would tell them, "This is where your parents came before you were born, before they knew what they were to each other, just 2 people looking at the same thing." He would tell them, "Some things belong to themselves and sharing them changes them, but changes them into something better." He would tell them, "This is what your mother meant when she said a life should be exactly the right size." He would tell them that their grandfather in Virginia had loved his land, and their grandfather in Boston had kept his letters, and that people contain more than they manage to express, and that grief and love can live together in the same drawer, and that it is possible to forgive what you cannot change. He would tell them the story of a telegram on a Tuesday morning, and a 4-day ride through red country, and a house with blue shutters, and a woman in a garden who looked up and did not stand, who made him coffee and showed him rocks, and named her specific life in words that were entirely honest. He would tell them that the East had sent him west looking for her, and that she had convinced him, not in argument but in demonstration, in the daily evidence of what a life built on purpose and attention and love for the specific place and the specific people in it could be, that the East had nothing worth returning to. He would tell them, "This is your home. These red hills and this wide sky and this creek and these apple trees and this particular blue are yours. Know them. Keep them." And they would look out from the top of the mesa in whatever year it was, a boy and a girl with dark eyes, and a combined stubbornness that the territory would need to reckon with. And the view would be the same 60 miles in every direction, and the hawks would turn their slow circles below, and the world would be, as it always had been, waiting to be exactly the right size for whoever had the courage to find out what that was. Margaret and Thomas Sullivan lived long in that territory, growing into the land as the land grew into them, season by season and year by year, until the house with the blue shutters was famous in the valley not for anything dramatic, but simply for being what it was. A place where people felt welcome and where the coffee was always good, and where two people who had found each other by accident or fate, or the simple mechanics of a Tuesday telegram had built something that was neither a fairy story nor a frontier legend but something more durable than either. Something true. Something that, years later, when the children asked where it had all started, could be answered in a single sentence. He had been sent to bring her back east, and she had convinced him, quietly and entirely and without any particular effort beyond simply being herself, that the East had nothing at all worth returning to. And he had stayed. And it had been, from the first evening on the porch to the last, exactly right.